Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sharice, and I am a board member here at NAMI, Maryland. I will be the moderator for your webinar today. Let's face it, first responders often deal with the unimaginable. The COVID-19 pandemic has created additional stressors that may feel overwhelming to an already difficult and sometimes dangerous job. Today, we are hosting two guests, Marc Junkerman and Michelle Warshauer, who will discuss the importance of creating a peer support team for first responders. Additionally, they will explain how critical incident stress management, CISM, can help guide how peers and clinicians integrate and work together within their roles. A case study and lessons learned from the field will be explored. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen professional circumstances, Lieutenant Stephen Thomas was unable to join us today. Before we get started, we wanted to note just a few housekeeping points. To avoid background noise, all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We will be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as the webinar continues, please enter them into the questions box, which is located on the right side of your screen if you're viewing from a computer, or the bottom of your screen if you're viewing from a phone. We will be reviewing questions as they come in, and if something in particular is unclear or needs to be expanded, we will ask our speakers to do so when the question is asked. If you have any comments or concerns during the webinar, please also enter these into the questions box. We will review and address any immediate needs as they occur. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to each registrant tomorrow. The recording will also be available on our website at www.namimaryland.org for any individuals that are unable to register. 1 hour of CEUs are available for Maryland Police, Corrections, and EMS professionals. Individuals pursuing CEUs must attend the whole webinar and submit the survey that will be presented to you at the end of today's webinar. A certificate of attendance will be sent to each registered participant tomorrow afternoon. After the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved on, and what you would like to see in future webinars. Each person that completes the survey will also be entered into a drawing to win $25 Amazon gift card. This is only one webinar in a series of educational webinars that NAMI Maryland plans to host. We plan to host 2 more webinars in this series between now and April, surrounding topics of cumulative trauma and compassion cultivation. We ask that you please fill out this survey to let us know how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. Now, I'd like to now welcome our speakers for today's webinar, Marc Junkerman and Michelle Warshauer. Marc Junkerman is an active law enforcement commander with over 27 years of experience. His tenure includes nearly 2 decades as a leader, a trainer, and advocate for the community and public safety behavioral health programs. Marc is fortunate to now have the opportunity to speak nationally on these topics. Michelle Warshauer is the Education and Training Curriculum Specialist at the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. Michelle is an ICISF approved instructor and is a member of the Arundel Police Department Critical Incident Stress Management Team. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Sharice.
Thanks, Sharice.
Mackenzie, can you advance the slide, please? So some of the material from this class comes from the ICISF Group Crisis and Assisting Individuals in Crisis class, authored by George Everly and Jeff Mitchell. Next slide, please. Here are a few objectives. We're going to understand the importance of setting up a peer support team for first responders. We're going to look at the different roles of peers and clinicians on the team. And we're going to talk about how to utilize critical incident stress management to structure peer support teams. Next slide, please. Why do we need peer support? That is the question. Next slide, please. So crisis and stress are related. We know this. When a person has an emotional crisis, there's also a state of mental and physical arousal, that's stress, that goes along with a state of emotional turmoil. This is our body's reaction. As part of human survival, our brains put chemicals into our body in reaction to a stressful event. And then our body reacts mentally, physically, and emotionally to these stress hormones that are now floating around that come from our brain. Next slide, please. So we do live in stress throughout our existence 24/7. Always we're balancing between eustress, which is good stress, and distress, which is bad stress. As an example, eustress is the excitement of going on vacation, and the distress is having to pay for the vacation. Stress is a state of arousal, and it goes from mild to extreme. It helps us to stay healthy. It motivates us to do things. Without eustress, many people would find a hard time, find it hard to find the motivation to get things done. So we need eustress. We need stress in our lives. And we have stress even when we don't have a crisis. That's just a part of human existence. But you cannot have a crisis without stress. We can also have anticipatory stress. That's anticipating things that may or may not happen in the future. Crisis always creates bad stress. So as we will see further on in another slide, that crisis is a reaction to an event, not the event itself. Many people mix up the terms. Next slide, please. And these specific populations, we know that 10 to 15% of law enforcement personnel have PTSD, 10 to 30% in fire suppression, 16% of Vietnam veterans came back with PTSD, and 12% of Iraq War veterans, PTSD, and then a much higher 20 to 25 for other problems, all combined with depression, etc. So why is the firefighter number higher than police? Well, we know that exposure to trauma has a dose-response relationship to PTSD. So the higher the exposure, the higher the risk for developing PTSD. Firefighters are there for everything. They're cutting people out of cars. They are performing life-saving things on, hurt people, dying people, people who are already dead. So car crashes, SIDS babies, firefighters are at all of those. Police come oftentimes after the worst part has already passed. So we know that fire suppression and EMTs are there for the very worst parts. So the dose-response relationship is higher. Therefore, there's a higher prevalence of PTSD. Next slide, please. These are some suicide statistics tracked by bluehelp.org for law enforcement suicides. You can see that in 2019, there were 228 officers that took their own lives, and in 2020, there have been 171. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that in the general population, 10 people out of 100,000 complete suicide. But in the law enforcement population, it's 17 out of 100,000 complete suicide. So there's your dose response relationship. Law enforcement officers, first responders of all sorts have a much higher exposure to trauma on a daily basis than civilians do. Most important bullet point on this slide is that an officer is 3 times more likely to kill themselves than be killed by a felon. So the danger is from within. Can you advance the slide, please? So why is the statistic so much higher for officers? And we're concentrating on officers because that is our our panel, but it's all first responders have a higher PTSD and suicide risk. So why the higher risk? So a lot of officers are very type A personality, tough, always in control. They don't need help because they are the helpers. So that makes it hard to reach out for help. They fly under the radar. Often they know how to kind of cover up the symptoms and signs that they're in distress because they have experience with people who are distraught. So they know how to hide it. There's a stigma of mental health. It should really be talked about. Mental health and therapy should be discussed as physical therapy is. There needs to be a cultural shift. Oftentimes, officers are afraid of losing their weapons and fearful of losing their job if they reach out for help. There's a fear of the unknown when it comes to psychiatric medications. And first responders have personal stress outside the workplace, just like civilians do. There's marital stress, spouse, elder care, financial stress, health stressors. Work affects home life and home affects work life, just like with civilians. So we have to remember that oftentimes a first responder's world may collide on the job. So they may respond to a crisis or a critical incident where something reminds them of their loved one or a problem that they just had in their personal lives. And this can be very distressing and needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about crisis intervention. Crisis intervention is a short-term helping process that's done by peers, and it's an acute intervention designed to stabilize and mitigate the crisis response. So this lets first responders know that their peers have gone through similar things. They're there for them to talk to. They understand the culture from the inside because they've worked with them. And this is not psychotherapy. This is a short-term helping process that deals with the matter at hand. We're not going back to the past. We're not talking about how your grandma was mean to you in 4th grade. We're not talking about any of that. We're not talking about what got you here. What we're talking about is the here and now. And Marc, you have an analogy that you like to use. This is your shoe store analogy, and I can't do it justice. Would you please jump in?
Yeah, when we talk about this, one of the things that we try to impart to people who are aspiring to be peers or to people who are engaging in, using peers for support is the fact that, listen, I would be lying to you if I told you that I could see through your eyes. I would be lying to you if I told you that I actually have walked in your shoes. I may have never experienced exactly what you're going through because that's very personal. What the peer brings, though, and why it's so important to have the peers involved is because while I may not have walked in those shoes, I may have shopped in that same shoe store. So I may be able to, if not directly understand, at least empathize and link some of my own experience and provide you that shoulder to lean on. So in the end, it's the ability to look somebody in the eye and go, you may not know exactly what happened, but you get why I feel the way I do and why I'm reacting the way I do. And that's a great segue to not only allow that individual to, let's say, catch their breath, start to reprocess, start to figure out some of the things that they need to do on their own, or to help that individual find the resources they may need beyond their own ability to self-help or self-care. So that peer sort of acts as a connector and then a conduit to whatever the individual needs, because in the end, it's about the person in need and not the peer or the clinician on the back end.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Next slide, please, Mackenzie. Thank you. So in crisis intervention, our goal is to foster natural resiliency. So you can see The typical path is we want to stabilize, we want to mitigate symptoms, and then the person that we're talking to will either return to adaptive functioning or we will facilitate access to a higher level of care. Most people will not require a higher level of care beyond initial crisis intervention. Most people's natural resilience will kick in if we do a few things, like stabilize and symptom mitigation. Stabilization can be as simple as letting that person change out of wet clothes, get something to eat and drink, use the restroom. Symptom mitigation is as simple as letting people know what they may be experiencing, what they may experience in the future, having to do with sleep, appetite, mood, etc. After we do these things, people's natural resilience has a tendency to kick in. And we want to remind them that they're having a human reaction to an inhuman event or a natural reaction to an unnatural event. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is very important. Crisis intervention targets the response, not the event. So crisis intervention and disaster mental health interventions are predicated upon assessment of need. So we want to look at what happened and what was the outcome. And for instance, if there were a car crash and people were injured, but they walked away with their lives and not terribly horrible or gory, is that going to have the same response by first responders as a fatality car crash where they're pulling deceased people out of the car? Probably not. We're going to look at who was affected, the victims, the family, people around, to see how this may affect the first responder. When victims are vulnerable, like children or the elderly, or anybody vulnerable, there's often a worse response by first responders because it really offends the morality of people that vulnerable people could be victimized. So everybody's response to an event is different. So what may bother one person, one first responder, may not bother another one, or it could bother them a little bit, but bother someone else very much more. So we want to target the response to the event and not just the event as a blanket whole response. Because if we start to treat people as if they should be having a response and they're not, then we create problems where there aren't. So we want to make sure that natural resilience is given a chance to kick in. Next slide, please. One approach that's frequently been used is critical incident stress management. This was formulated by Dr. Jeffrey Mitchell and expanded on by Dr. George Everly and others since then, since the 1980s. Next slide, please. So CISM, critical incident stress management, is comprehensive, phase-sensitive, integrated, and multi-component. What this means is there's a lot of different interventions that you can learn, that you can deploy. There are one-on-one interventions. There are group interventions. These are structured. There are steps to follow, and they are time-sensitive. So depending on how long ago the event was, we will change up what intervention we use. Next slide, please. There are a bunch of different core competencies. In the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of blaze through them. We want to assess if people are having benign versus malignant symptoms. We want to have strategic planning employed. So this is some training that before the event, hopefully most peer support teams get to engage in. There's one-on-one crisis intervention, there's small group crisis intervention, large group crisis intervention, and then when it comes to follow-ups, 3 to 5 follow-ups is routine. Any more than that, once you get to 6 or 8, you need to refer to a higher level of care, just to make sure that that person is getting everything that they need. And because this is a short-term helping intervention, 6 to 8 is no longer short-term. So that's when a mental health professional that that you need to have on your peer support team will be able to help refer out to a higher level of care. It's important that peer support teams have some back pockets resources that they're able to steer people towards when they need a higher level of care. Mental health professionals are always on a peer support team so that they can assess when this has gone beyond the normal levels of peer support and crisis intervention. Next slide, please. Post-traumatic growth. So as you can see, in post-traumatic growth, what we want to do is emerge on the other side of distress and dysfunction as a better human. Many people are able to take stress and things that they've been through, traumatic experiences, and turn it around and be better for it. And this is our ultimate goal. A lot of people who come through this kind of experience often become helpers themselves and often become peers on peer support teams. Marc, do you have anything to add to that, or do you want me to move on?
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about, when we talk about the pros and cons, when we get to the tail end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about that balance because, yeah, many people are attracted or aspire to be part of a peer team because they've had a positive experience. But the double-edged sword is we want to make sure, and we'll talk about this a little bit with some personal experiences at the end of the presentation or near the end about the need to ensure that your peers are also healthy. You want to make sure that there are procedures, strategies, and safeguards in place to ensure that the people that are providing the help are also in a good place themselves, and that after they provide the help, there is what we call post-action staff support. Basically, we're making sure we're helping the helpers. So yeah, that's critical to make sure you're not absorbing everybody else's sins, for lack of a better term.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Who should do crisis intervention? Well, both mental health clinicians and peer support personnel can perform crisis intervention and CISM services. There is some concern among professional groups that peers are doing crisis intervention and peer support, but it's been well accepted among the community mental health movement for over 50 years. Next slide, please.
Michelle, if I put on that to help qualify and quantify that too as a peer, here's the way I kind of look at my role as a peer. Michelle's the clinician who does a couple important things. First of all, she makes sure I stay in my lane. Second, she provides that expertise to ensure that when somebody does need that assistance, that there is somebody there to actually do a legitimate, let's say, a professional assessment that's well beyond the scope of my training as a peer. A peer is a buoy. My job is if somebody falls off the boat, I give them a place to swim to and something to hang on to until they do one or two things. As Michelle's talked about, the vast majority of people with good information and a little bit of support are going to be able to catch their breath, kind of formulate a plan, and swim on their own. Being that buoy allows that individual to hang on and basically engage in that activity. It allows them to pause, reset, and then take care of themselves. If they can't do that, then I have a bell on a light. And what the individual does is they kind of rock the buoy. That bell on the light summons a boat. That's where Michelle, the clinicians, and that follow-on services come. They're the boat that takes that individual from the buoy when they can't swim on their own and takes them to get the additional support services that they need. So when we talk about CISM, and there's different models, there's different approaches, one of the things I think is very important is that peers and clinicians work in tandem, but they do have specific roles, and the best teams are the ones that understand their individual roles and can integrate them and have sort of that smooth handoff and that smooth overlap, if that kind of clarifies sort of the difference between the role of the peer and the clinician, at least in my mind, on a solid team.
Thank you. So we want to use peers when the recipient group is specially trained and educated. That's our first responders. The group possesses a unique culture. Group members perceive themselves as unique, little understood and misunderstood, in group and out group. The group extends minimal trust to those outside the group, and it's generally not necessary with groups from the general populations of primary victims. So that's civilians, but we're talking about peer support, first responders. Next slide, please. Some cautions with peer support. There needs to be a professional mental health guidance and support attached to peer support teams, and the need to view it as first aid. It's the first point and only one point on the overall continuum of care. It's not the end all be all, but it is a great first step. And knowing when you're in over your head and underestimating the severity. So that's when clinician oversight becomes really important, because sometimes peers get in over their heads, as does everybody. And we need to be able to reach out and say, hey, what do you think about this? And bounce something off a clinician that you have access to. Next slide, please. On a CISM team, you need at least 2 CISM trained members, at least 1 mental health clinician, and other team members can be spiritual leaders, chaplains, another mental health professional, or a physical health professional. And it's very important, all team members must be trained. At the very least, have the group and individual crisis intervention course. And then ongoing training has to be completed as well. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into the evolution of the Anne Arundel County Police peer support team. Mark and I are going to handle Steve Thomas's portion and kind of tell his story as it's been told to us. Next slide, please. In January 2014, Lieutenant Thomas was called to the chief's office and was told to start a CIT and peer support program. He didn't know anything about how to do this, so he reached out to Marc Junkerman and asked what to do. Marc kind of served as a mentor and told Steve, what to get trained in, like mental health first aid, and get trained in critical incident stress management, and to just keep learning, just learn at any opportunity you can. I don't know if you want to jump in here, Marc, if you have anything to add to that one.
Yeah, so this is from my experience, and things have evolved greatly. So just so we clarify what we're talking about here, CIT is crisis intervention teams. So crisis intervention teams are generally public safety teams, professionals, programs, and their job is to integrate behavioral health and public safety and public service together. So generally what you have with a CIT team, it is a law enforcement clinician partnership in some form or fashion that helps to deliver behavioral health services to the community. The idea is that if our first responders, particularly our law enforcement officers, can recognize symptoms of mental illness, are familiar with resources, are familiar with de-escalation techniques, then we have the ability to divert people out of the criminal justice system and help them actually obtain behavioral health support that is better than jail, frankly. So the goal is to create these relationships in the community and be able to recognize when somebody is in a mental health crisis, and if it's appropriate and if it's available, to divert that individual from the criminal justice systems to help. What does this have to do with peer support? CIT was one of the sort of flagship behavioral health programs that started to evolve. I got involved in about 2005, and that was the first step in my journey with let's say community behavioral health. It was, what programs do we have in our agencies that can help the community? What can we roll out to the community and serve them better with? CIT is based on something called the Memphis model in the most robust format, developed by Major Cochran, Memphis, Tennessee. A lot of research, evidence-based, similar to CISM, similar to mental health first aid, which is another program. What then we started talking about as we started rolling these programs out for the general public. Some of us who were involved, we looked at ourselves, we looked in the mirror, we looked around, and we said, this is a really great program. This is really sort of unique, and it's forward thinking about recognizing that mental health is not only a concern, but trying to destigmatize it and actually trying to be part of the solution as opposed to just shuffling the deck, for lack of a better term, and moving the person from one sort of place to another without actually getting them the help. What we realized was while we were doing this for the public, there was very little for the first responders. So the evolution of CIT started to bring peer support once again to the forefront. To be clear, peer support had been around, well before I got involved with it, but I know in my piece of the world here in Maryland, CIT was the segue that helped us, as at least me as a Maryland police officer, as a law enforcement officer, recognize that this behavioral health approach, this behavioral health recognition is just as important for us who are serving the public as it is for the public itself. So because my particular area where I worked at the time was starting to implement some of these programs, we sort of were a pilot for a number of counties. And like everything else that's that you grow and you nurture, I'm very proud and honored to say, the little bit of things we may have done on the front end have allowed people to stand on our shoulders. And Anne Arundel County, frankly, has developed into one of the most robust agencies in terms of not only CIT, but also with the peer support. So I guess the moral of the story is, you ask people who maybe have a little bit of knowledge, you share that knowledge, and that makes us all better in the long run. And that's why, in my mind, this sort of approach works, because it's not about somebody telling me what I need to do. It's about us actually internalizing that, recognizing this, and becoming advocates for not only the public, but for ourselves. It's the difference between, the intrinsic sort of self-motivation versus somebody being a cheerleader from the outside. And that's one of the reasons why Anne Arundel County's team has progressed. And Michelle, you working with Steve can attest to that, I think. So
For sure. The next slide will kind of go through some steps of how that developed. So the whole reason we're here is to find out what you need to do to start a team. You need people with the passion to help, for sure. It's best if team members are self-selected and not told that they need to be on the peer support team, because these are people who definitely have the desire to make a difference. Departmental leadership buy-in is very important. It can be done from the bottom up, but it's tough to gain traction. It's tough to keep getting funding. It's tough to get training from the bottom up. It's best if you have leadership buy-in from the top down. It needs to be part of the culture so that it can expand throughout the whole department. And with leadership buy-in, that makes it much easier to become part of the culture. You need some outside leadership to help guide you, mentors there, as Marc was a mentor to Steve. Clinical support, we talked about the importance of having clinicians on the team. And of course, you need training. ICISF, who I work for, we offer the individuals in crisis and the group crisis intervention training. This is the most basic gateway training for all your team members to get. There are a lot of different ways to get this training. We'll touch on that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So if it's part of the culture, it's definitely a lot more than a checklist. This is when things like an FOP meal train comes in, where if you have a member of the department who has a line of injury duty, or maybe they have cancer, or maybe their wives just had a baby, or anything, it can be anything. Many times a meal train is organized so that at least the family doesn't have to worry about meals. It's just doing what needs to be done to make the officers' lives easier, and peer support can help with that by finding out what people need. So this also intersects with police reform, with the idea that officers should be treated the same way that they're expected to treat the community, with the respect, with a culture of helping. And instead of asking, what is wrong with you? We want to ask, what has happened to you and what have you experienced? It's a much different way to ask the same question, and it builds that bridge of empathy instead of, you know, kind of adding an air of judgment. It's what has happened? How can I help? And it's any way that you can help. You need to be innovative, and the peer support teams can jump in any way that they see fit. Next slide, please. So success breeds success. The first call out that the Anne Arundel County team went on was a youth suicide. A 14-year-old took her own life. Steve Thomas did debriefs with the officers that responded. They found it really helpful. They spread the word. A few days later, there was a killing of a 14-year-old by her 18-year-old sibling. Again, peer support responded, and the officers wrote letters, put it up the chain of command, how helpful they found it. And within a month, the peer support team was fully up and running with full blessings from the chain of command. So the CIT unit then became the also peer support headquarters as well. So the success breeds success. A few positive interactions with first responders to really traumatic events can really show people what it can be used for, what CISM can be used for. Next slide, please. We did use peer support teams to respond to the Capitol Gazette shooting that happened in 2018. Many different jurisdictions came in to help. Marc and I helped. We came from different counties. We just did what needed to be done. We showed up the next day without knowing what we were going to do, only knowing that we'd had the same training. We'd had the same group and individual crisis intervention training, so we spoke the same language. And so when we were asked if we could partner up and do a debrief at one department, it was not a problem at all. We knew the steps to go through. We knew what each role played, Marc as a peer and myself as a clinician, and we just fell into it seamlessly. We were also able to pivot and change up some interventions without even speaking about it, because we realized that the timing was not correct for us to be doing a particular intervention that we had been asked to do. So we were able to change that on the spot since we had the same training. That's the importance of training. With the unrest at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, many different jurisdictions came in to help. Many people from around the region were there to help. In Maryland, we do have regional partnerships. It's a loose collection of mutual aid. Marc can speak a little bit more about that, but we all jump in to help each other, especially when something happens at your own department. It's too close to home, and we really shouldn't be debriefing people in our own department when it has hit us as a tragedy and as a trauma as well. Marc, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so and some of the highlights, again, we'll hit a couple of these points. What we have found through experience, and one of the sort of watershed moments for, in my mind, for Maryland, particularly the law enforcement peer support program, was the unrest in 2015 in Baltimore City. We realized that after that situation, there were a number of, well, there was an entire department who had experienced something that was extremely out of the norm for your routine daily sort of assignment. It was very visible. It was national news. It was very impactful. It was very intense for a lot of reasons. And what that happened to coincide with was the ICISF World Congress. So the World Congress is basically a biannual gathering of peer support people from around the world, and they happen to meet in Baltimore. And those in attendance in Baltimore, literally weeks after we had stood down from, dealing with the unrest and addressing the unrest and protecting each other and the city and the people who were engaged in their First Amendment rights, we kind of said, man, Baltimore City Police, they could probably use some help. And we kind of looked left and right and we went, you know what, we've got like a whole convention center full of some of the best people in the world. Different techniques, they're all there under the same umbrella at this World Congress. Why not start piecing together a sort of a response? And I call that either the World Congress model or the Baltimore model, because what we were able to do is we used tenets of National Incident Management, which we call the ICS. So there is an incident command system that all public safety is trained with. Basically, what we did is we used that model as our structure and as our management and as our sort of leadership conduit, and we overlaid peer support. And what we were able to do was provide the entire Baltimore City Police Department, 2,000 plus officers and sworn, non-sworn bosses, street level people. We, in essence, within a week, were able to do somewhere in the neighborhood of like 72 roll calls and like 15 different special sessions of peers coming in and basically saying, hey, this was stressful. This is what you might be experiencing. You're not by yourself. If you need help, we're here to listen, and we can also plug you into support. So kind of circling around, what that did was, for us here in Maryland, highlighted the fact that when you need help, you don't have to just rely on yourself. And sometimes it's better to ask for outside help because you may be too close. And when I talk about my last couple slides at the end, we'll talk about how that model sort of, that model that I am honored to help put together actually supported my own agency and my own people about a year later. So.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
So this is good intentions never beats experience. And this is just a little, well, I'll let you see it and we'll go from here. So this is sort of the segue into my couple slides here. Good intentions never beats experience. And this is where we start talking about how some of the lessons learned and some of the things that we've done in the past have worked out, and sometimes when they didn't work out so well. So one of the things I focus on now is I'm starting to pivot some of my, or a lot of my focus. We have really good clinicians. We have really good training. We have really good response and sort of the ability to respond and to mitigate critical incidents. When we look at what they call the 5 missionaries, there's 5 things we do in critical incidents or sort of in these sort of large scale deployments. One of the things we always want to be talking about is obviously response and mitigation. How do we get there? How do we respond? How do we sort of deal with the immediate acute problem, situation, challenges, whatever? What we used to forget about is the fact that on the back end of that is recovery. So it's response, mitigation, and recovery. Peer support has started to gain traction and come to fruition. And just in general with clinicians, this idea that after a critical incident, that recovery phase is as important or maybe even more important than the response and the mitigation. If you argue that maybe it's not as important, one of the things that we do know is a lot of times it's much longer. Critical incidents, depending on the type of critical incident, can last minutes to hours with the actual first responders engaged. Sometimes they run longer. There are cases where, I can think of the situation where they had the sniper, the Pennsylvania State Police were dealing with, who was engaging troopers who had shot a trooper up in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. That was a week-long, I think at least, sort of search for that individual. But for the most part, the critical incidents themselves are fairly compact as compared to the recovery that it takes and the back end sort of interventions that are needed to sort of get your traction and regain your sea legs, as I like to say, to be able to get your balance back, get your stasis back after these. So we started to realize that and talk about, this is why the peer support is important. What I'm starting to recognize now is, as I said, there's 5 mission areas. So we just talked about response and mitigation and now recovery. The front 2 are prevention and protection. One of the things that I really advocate for now, and what kind of is illustrated by this little sort of clip here, this tongue-in-cheek clip, is the idea of front-end inoculation, about prevention and protection on the front end, about what are we doing. The term is left of bang. There's a book. Patrick Van Horn wrote a book called Left of Bang, and it's a tactical book, but the concept is this: you have an incident, which is the bang. The people who weather those incidents the best are the ones who prepare and train before it actually happens. They can anticipate and they can prepare. So when the bang actually happens, when that critical incident actually occurs, you're sort of inoculated. You have a mindset, you have an approach. And that is where a lot of my focus has now shifted to. That idea that well before there is a critical incident, I, as an individual, need to take some ownership for myself and do some things for me. And my agency needs to do some things, or your agency needs to do some things well before that bang happens in order to prepare for it. A key component of that is behavioral health, is peer support, but it's a holistic approach. So our gentleman here is scraping his car. He's scraping his heart out. 4 tenets, and these are management tenets. These are not necessarily behavioral health sort of ideas. You can overlay behavioral health into it, but these are just basic sort of leadership 101 things. One of the first things, he doesn't understand his environment. You have to understand your operational environment, embrace it. He's not quite dressed for shoveling, for scraping a car. He doesn't have the necessary equipment, he doesn't have the necessary stuff. So that's the first thing. He maybe doesn't understand the environment. If he did understand the environment and okay, maybe, he missed the weather report. The second part is arming yourself to be able to basically detect challenges when they're when they first pop up on your radar screen. So in a perfect world, you want something to pop up on your radar screen and you want to say, what is that? And try to start evaluating that. And in the military world, we call that a bogey. We don't know what it is. We're not sure what it is. But we watch it, we assess, we recognize that we have something, we prioritize. Do we need to address that now, later, whenever? And a lot of that is depending on if we need to mitigate it or if we just need to monitor it. So the first tenet is understand your operational environment. The second tenet is arm yourself for risk management. Try to anticipate what you may run into before it happens. This gentleman maybe didn't anticipate, didn't watch the weather, didn't even look outside when it was snowing and say, hey, maybe I might have to scrape the car. The third thing that we encourage everybody to do personally and professionally as an agency is to win by design, not by default. And the idea is this: you play the percentages. I like to tell people, if you are going to play a game of chance, you want to be the casino and not the person sitting on the other side of the table. Why? Because the games of chance are slightly shifted in the favor of that casino. If you have a choice of having a 51% chance of victory versus a 49% chance of victory, you take the 51%. Again, this gentleman, even though he is well-intentioned, he is good-hearted. He already doesn't understand the operational environment or didn't embrace his operational environment. He didn't engage in arm himself for risk management, and he really doesn't have a plan. If not, he would have an ice scraper. He wouldn't be out there with his hand. If you do those things, the hope is that you create a culture and not just a program or a team. And the idea of this peer support as being part of a larger culture of wellness, resiliency, a holistic approach, mind, body, and spirit, is truly where I think we're going to make our money as we move ahead in the future. We are good at responding. We are good at the mitigation. We're getting better at the recovery because, one, we practice response and mitigation, and two, we've had enough incidents, unfortunately, where we're understanding that recovery process. What we still sort of lack is that front-end inoculation, that protection, and that prevention. So the next couple slides we hit, and if you can advance the slide, Mackenzie, we'll talk about that. This is recommendations from a salty old vet, which happens to be me in this case. And these are things that I want you to think about when we talk about those four areas about my operational. Do I understand my operational environment, that culture? Do I understand my risks? Do I have a plan? Can I win by design, not default? And am I creating am I just creating a program? Am I just checking a box? Or am I actually creating a culture? These are some things that that I've experienced, and I'll give you a little overview of a couple of the bullet points here. One of the questions I want you to ask yourself as we talk about these is, when you are sitting on the other end of this webinar and you're thinking about maybe starting a peer team or expanding your peer team or trying to sell a peer team to your executive, ask yourself what scares you. What are the scary points? What are the pitfalls? What are the potholes you might run into? And think of them ahead of time. And if you overlay those four ideas, you sort of manage the risk, you have a plan, you may find answers to those before the questions are even asked, and that's going to help you in the long run. So one of the things I talk about, and Michelle hit on this, and it's a great point, and it's worth circling back, is I call it the tall hats have the juice, but the line supervisors make it happen. We often forget that the executives are the ones who make the decision. The leadership makes the decisions, and they have the purse strings, so they control the troops' time and treasure. And we tend to push that down to the user level, the end user level. And a lot of times that is in the form of our newest members of the agency, our recruits, our frontline people, our people with a little less tenure, or our people who are, let's say, the operators on the street. What we often forget about is that mid-level management, depending on how your agency is structured, whether it's a corporal, a sergeant, a lieutenant. Those mid-level managers, those supervisors, those overseers are the ones that actually translate the ideas into the reality and make it happen. So when we are selling these programs, when we are advocating for these programs, yes, the executives have to be on board because you're not going to get the funding, the policy. You're not going to get the things you need to sustain these. But in order for this to actually become a culture, you have to have those mid-level men and women who are out there every day, who are doing the daily oversight, who are enforcing the policies, who are managing the risks, and who are coming up with the plans. You have to have buy-in from them. You have to have them on board. What I see are the better agencies are the ones where those that happens. The teams with the best peer support, the best resiliency, are the ones where the mid-level supervisors have made it part of the culture and they embrace it. There's some few agencies in Northern Virginia that have really robust wellness programs, and they're fitness based, not just mental health based. So there's an approach there. I've seen the EAP programs evolve, where we target these mid-level managers and help them understand that EAP is not just about behavioral health. It's also a concierge service. So there's services in there that help our men and women understand everything from, their financial needs to finding a placement for their mom and dad. And what we tell these mid-level supervisors, this is going to make your daily job easier because you're going to create healthier troops. You need these men and women to help build that safety net. Another thing I caution, and I've seen this happen. I've seen it happen personally, and I've seen it happen in other agencies. Don't be the if you are creating a peer support program, if you are creating this peer support culture, one of the things you need to be very cognizant of is don't become the default for discipline or dysfunction. And here's what I mean. My role as a peer is to be a connector and a conduit. I am somebody that a man or woman wearing a similar uniform can connect with because we share similar experience, we share similar culture. You know, I grew up in a city, and think about some of the neighborhoods in the city. You know, often they're sort of cultural based neighborhoods. Why is that? Because you want to, particularly when you're uncomfortable or when you're new, you surround yourself with people who speak the same language, eat the same foods, do the same things. As a peer, my job is to help people who are being integrated into my culture understand that there's things that they need to do from day one in order to stay healthy and happy. They need to remain good people in order to become good police officers and peace officers. What can happen sometimes with the peer support, if you're not careful, is anything that either an individual or the agency maybe either doesn't want to deal with or is not equipped to deal with or hasn't thought about dealing with, you become the default. So if it's a performance issue, suddenly it goes to peer support. If there's a dysfunction where somebody is acutely in distress, instead of reaching out to a clinician who are the people who should be helping them, they hand it to a peer. And you can sometimes water down your role. And I want to caution you against that. Your job as a peer is to be that buoy, is to be that conduit. Supervisors, clinicians provide therapy and help. You as that peer are the one who integrate and kind of give the direction and help steer people where they need to be. But you cannot be the end all be all, nor should you. And if you start to become that, then you need to look in the mirror and realize that you may be, as I like to say, outrunning your headlights. One of the things you need to be very careful of as a peer is to not overstep your training, your mandates, and your role. Only healthy peers can provide healthy support. We talked about this earlier, that the fact that people who gravitate towards peer teams often have benefited from the peer team, from the experience of the peer team or the clinician. One of the things I really encourage, though, is when you do your whatever the screening process, whatever the process you decide to use to select peers, that you're ensuring that people are there for the right reasons and that they're also healthy. Often I have seen, and maybe often is not, on occasion, I have seen individuals who are well-meaning, good-hearted people, but frankly, they're joining the peer team because it's almost self-therapy, or because they think that they're going to save somebody. Here's one of the hardest things I had to learn as a peer. I'm really good as a police officer because I'm trained that way, saving people from each other. You really can't save somebody from themselves. You can encourage them, you can give them tools, you can show them a path, but the decision to save yourself is your personal decision. And I think it's very important that you remember that these peers are there. It's about the support you are providing the others. This is not about self-therapy or using it to deal with your own demons. The flip side of that is at some point, just like anything else, you have to look after each other as peers. You have to make sure that people aren't burned out. You have to make sure that people aren't taking on too much. At some point, you have to make sure you have a program or some sort of formal assessment where your peers who are providing that support are also getting, for lack of a better term, a head check, a buddy check, a holistic approach to ensure that they're still healthy and that they are not experiencing their own challenges, which they're going to suppress because it's like Dr. Heal Thyself. Some of the worst patients are the practitioners because you think you can handle it and you really can't. Embrace the fact you need help, and we talked about this. I talked about shortly after, within a year of the incident in Baltimore, I had a tragedy My agency suffered 2 line of duty deaths. There was a violent encounter, so it was a felonious, 2 line of duty felonious deaths in the same incident. And when my executives approached me and said, hey, how are you going to handle this as a peer support coordinator? What are you going to do? I kind of looked at them and said, I'm not going to do a whole lot. And what do you mean? I said, I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to call some people and I'm going to run some ideas by them. And those same people who maybe I helped in Baltimore City, some of those same people after that unrest when we came down and provided that support, they were the same people that then responded to my agency and helped me. Anne Arundel County was a part of that. Prince George's County, Montgomery. I can go on. I can't give enough thanks for the outpouring of help. But what I realized from that Baltimore model was, you know what, if an agency of 2,000 people with all those resources can't take care of themselves, how's an agency where we were a quarter of that size, how are we actually going to weather this storm? So basically, for once, I tried to, as I like to say, be smart and not hard. And I took a step back, realized that I wasn't okay. I couldn't handle this on my own. And I did that thing that sometimes sends a chill up a first responder's back, particularly a cop. I actually asked for help. I said, you know what, I'm a little weak right now. I'm a little hurt and I don't need to be doing this. Can you help me? And I was shocked to find out that, yeah, it was there. And we've been using that model in Maryland ever since. We've used it in active shooter incidents, other active assailant incidents we've had. We used it at the Gazette. And most recently, we used that similar model when a group of us went down to provide peer support for the U.S. Capitol Police. I say be aware of amateurs, opportunists, and ghouls. I hate to say this, but, you know, in my line of duty desk, we actually had a situation where we had unauthorized vendors who were selling shirts, and the proceeds weren't going to the families. The proceeds weren't going to things. You have sometimes very well-meaning people who want to help, who basically, they don't necessarily have the skill set, the training, or the experience. You also have people who are opportunists and, like I say, downright ghouls, who in your moment of crisis will try to capitalize. Be very careful who you let in your house. The way to help inoculate yourself with that is right now, while things are going good, while things are not in crisis, start developing those relationships and those teams and that trust now. So when bad things happen, you know that the people who are responding and the people you're calling are people you can trust and rely on. Can you hit the next slide, please, Mackenzie? And I'm going to finish up with this. You know, so we talked about some of the things that, you know, what scares you and what are some of the pitfalls and what are some of the experiences I had. But let's kind of end this on kind of a high note. Here's some of the good things. Here's some of the things I've seen that have really worked. You know, make it a small part of something bigger. And that's what we just talked about. Not just your peer support, supporting other peer supports, but thinking of your peer support program, this peer support culture as part of this wellness and resiliency culture. I look at our first responders as trapeze artists. You are specially selected, you are highly trained, you have to go out in public on the high wire or on the trapeze every night and lay it on the line, and it's zero fail. And if you mess it up, everybody sees you mess it up. What gives you the confidence is the net underneath you. It's that net that catches you. Create a net. Make your peer support part of a bigger net. Mental health doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of physical health. It's part of wellness. It's part of nutrition. It's part of fitness. It's part of your financial fitness. It's a part of things that help the family. You know, your family support systems. It's your occupational safety. So in my world, it's wearing your body armor. It's wearing your seatbelt. I encourage you to use your peers to help create a net. So if somebody falls off that trapeze, they're going to hit the strand they need to support them. If all you have is one strand that says mental health, you may catch some people, but you're going to miss a lot of other people. And unfortunately, what may happen is you then create a mental health issue or problem, because if it wasn't mental health before, it is now because of the impact of it. Mental health is, again, only one item off the buffet, and that's what we just kind of talked about. Encourage peers to choose a peer team and build the trust. And here's what, you know, I can tell you from my experience. the best teams I see are the ones who their selection process is maybe a little different than the usual selection process. You know, we fill out applications and you do things and you stuff. It starts with somebody coming up to you and going, you want to be on a peer team? You want to get trained in, or better yet, they put team aside. Do you want to get trained in peer support? Why would I want to do that? I don't want to be on a team. I didn't say anything about being on a team. I said, do you want to be peer support? Well, I don't know if I want to do that. You do realize that the reason I'm coming up to you is because you're already doing it. Everybody comes to you every day anyway. You are the person that people gravitate towards. And when I ask, hey, if you had a problem, if you wanted to run something by somebody, who would you trust? Who would you trust? Your name keeps coming up over and over and over again. If you're doing it anyway, how about I just get you training? To me, that fosters that trust right out of the gate. And the best peer teams are the ones where the selection process is such that the peers choose who they trust versus some sort of formal process. Again, I realize there's always got to be some personnel processes and things like that, but I think that goes a long way. We talked about working left to bang. We talked about that concept. So if bang is here, we want to be left to bang. We want to be left to the dial. We want to inoculate on the front end and decide what we should do before bad things happen. And the other thing is, and you can probably tell by the way I talk with my hands and talk fast and loud, that you got to be relentless. This is a commitment. I tell people, if you want to have a true resiliency wellness program in your agency, you got to think of it of a ham, like a ham and eggs breakfast or a bacon and eggs breakfast. In a bacon and eggs breakfast, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. You need to be the bacon. You need to be the bacon, and you need to commit and be relentless. And sometimes that means you might not make everybody happy. But you know what? Anything worth doing, sometimes you're not always going to be the most popular. So that's my little piece of the presentation. And Sharisa, can we maybe open it up to some questions if we have some out there?
Of course, of course. Wow, wonderful presentations. Thank you both for providing this critical information during this great time of need. So, as Marc said, we're going to open up the webinar now for any questions that you may have. Remember that every participant will stay muted to avoid background noise, but you can type your questions into the question box at the right-hand side of your screen if you're viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of the screen if you're viewing from a phone. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, or if you have a comment about the webinar today, please enter these into the questions box. If we do not have time to answer each question today, we will provide our contact information at the end of the webinar for anyone who may wish to reach us. Let's start with our first question. First question, are interventions with first responders mandatory?
No, they're always voluntary. The quickest way to get somebody turned off to peer support and CISM is to make something mandatory. So we want to make sure that it's a voluntary basis, and we want to make sure that they know that up front. That's one of the first things we say, that this is a voluntary process. You're not required to be here. We also do make it known that this is not an operational critique. This is just about your experience, your feelings, your thoughts about the incident.
Okay. How can you tell if a first responder needs help or not?
Marc?
So I think a lot of that, it comes to that, building that sort of peer, having that knowledge. Here's what I can say in a nutshell. The man or woman who is working with that peer on a daily basis, they are the conduit. And that's why when you look at, again, solid peer teams or peer teams at their best, the peers themselves often are not, let's say, the tripwire or the trigger. They are the navigators. In the most perfect world, I am in a situation where I get on the phone and somebody calls me and says, hey, Junk, I'm with Johnny or Janie here, and we've got a question, or can you steer us in the right direction? And they give me some information, and I go, you know what? You're doing, you got this. Here's a resource, here's this, here's that. You keep running with that. Or I go, you know what? I'm coming out, or I'm sending somebody out to you. Here's what I know, and to kind of answer the question in a nutshell, here's we'll pick peers. One of the mistakes I've seen is somebody says, hey, I'd really like to run something by you. And the response is, well, let me give you a list of people who have a jacket or who are on our call out roster. I didn't pick that person. I picked you. Everybody is a peer. Take ownership for yourself. Commit to a daily mission. Once you do that, you take care of the me. Now you start taking care of the we. And that's where we're accountable to and for each other. You got to remember, you're not a badge wearing a person, you're a person wearing a badge. Once you commit to your own wellness, then you are not only able, but you are responsible for that man or woman next to you. That's peer support. That's accountability. And that is, if you want to talk about reform, that's always been there. It's just bringing that into the forefront as this is the culture that we need, not just that we want. So
I'd like to add to that. Marc sort of talked about the safety net. So if you create this net where everybody's kind of, it's a little creepy, kind of watching each other, you notice those subtle behaviors. You notice that somebody's more quiet than usual. Somebody may be acting out sexually or drinking too much when they're not normally a drinker, or any kind of odd behavior that is out of the range of normal. If you are engaged with your peers and you're paying attention, you would notice and say, hey man, what's up? Or hey, do you have time for a cup of coffee or whatever? Anything that's organic is a way to show interest, and that person may open up to you.
Thank you. Next question. Is it expensive to start a CISM team?
So I've seen people start it with nothing, and I've seen people start it with lots of funding. Now, training does cost money, but there are ways to get it at a discount. There are ways to have somebody trained up within your department to train your own people for free. Kind of where there's a will, there's a way. Steve and I do training for first responders in Arundel County. We're both approved instructors for ICISF. And if we have space left in our class, we open it up to first responders from other jurisdictions. Many times they just have to pay for the books, which is nominal, $25, $40, something like that. And a lot of times scholarships are offered. So there are ways to do it. Marc, you have more, I think, info.
Yeah, I guess here's what I'm going to say. There's a cost to everything. My question is, what's the cost of not having a wellness and resiliency program? What's the cost of not having a peer team? What's the cost of, in terms of medical benefits, in terms of absenteeism, presenteeism, in terms of the long-term impact of mental health, the impact that, God forbid, you have a suicide? What's your front-end investment? If you do the cost-benefit analysis, the front-end investment is going to be nominal compared to the returns you're going to get on the back end. So I think you have to factor that in.
All right. I would like to know what experiential methods are being used with first responders, especially considering that traumatic stress is physiologically stored.
Okay, we have a clinician in the house. So many clinicians do offer EMDR. That's one example. Eye movement desensitization. There's a special training for that. That doesn't really fall under CISM or CIT training. But EMDR can be used to kind of release some of that, the physiological symptoms, used for symptom mitigation as well. I know that Marc has participated in a lot of yoga. That's experiential.
Yeah, we talk about yoga. We talk about this whole mind, body, spirit, holistic approach. So we know one of the things that helps to bleed off that stress is exercise. And if we integrate, our usual fitness routine with the yoga, with the mindfulness, we find that has helped in some instances. It's also ubiquitous. It doesn't matter your build, your age. There's a little something in that for everybody. The other thing we're starting to delve into, and this is something where we've had some really good clinicians help out with some of our trainings, is we're looking at some of the training methodologies that we use, and we're actually bringing in clinicians to explain not just adult learning, but the physiological and the psychological effects of training. So we are asking them to help us understand what happens when your body experiences good training. What happens? What's the best way for people to actually create this muscle memory? What's the best way for people to actually have confidence? And what we're seeing is that is as physiological as it is, in terms of like say educational. When we look at our formatting, we know that the stress in training, we are starting to inoculate our bodies and getting our bodies used to certain pathways, certain abilities to mitigate those chemical reactions, to mitigate those psychological, those emotional reactions. So for me, from my standpoint, from a management and leadership, it's how am I training on that front end to inoculate myself and to understand that physiology. So when it kicks in, I can do one of two things. I can either try to reduce and mitigate those physical and psychological reactions, those human reactions on the front end, or at least understand once I get a certain dump, I'm kind of along for the ride. And this is a huge part with the peer support and with the mental health, where this allows me to go to a first responder and go, this is not because you're weak. This is not because you're broken. This is not because you're not training hard enough. You are simply having a physiological or a psychological reaction. The only thing you're guilty of is being human. So you know what? Let's train better so you understand those reactions. You can maybe sort of prevent some of them by some of the things you can do on the front end, and by giving yourself the ability to recover after those, to say, you know what, this is a normal reaction. I need to stand down. The smart operator is the one who says, I need to step out and catch my breath, as opposed to trying to keep up. Here's what happens. If you are what we call non-mission capable, you have now become part of my problem and not part of my solution. Because if I'm counting on you to perform a mission and watch my back, and you physically, psychologically, or emotionally can't, I need you to step off to the sidelines, put somebody else in, get yourself together with the anticipation, with a little bit of help, with a little bit of a break, with a little bit of training and acknowledgement. We're going to get you back into the fight. And that's our goal, is to get you back into the fight, not to pull you out of the fight.
Thank you. Who do I speak to about creating a peer support team for the first responders in my area?
Michelle, I'm going to kick that to you with ICISF.
Yeah. Thank you. The ICISF website has some great resources. There's actually a tab that says, how can I start a team? So you would go to ICIS as in Sam, F as in Frank.org, and look for that information. You can reach out to me, Michelle W. at ICISF.org, or to the general question mailbox at ICISF, and we can get you more detailed information if what you see on the site doesn't meet your needs. But there are lots of resources. No reason to reinvent the wheel. Lots of people have come before you and tread the same path. So we are here to help people organize and get started.
Okay. Are there Spanish language peer support teams available for first responders in Maryland?
Michelle, I know ICISF keeps a roster. I don't know of any, let's say, specific teams that are all Spanish speakers, but I do know of teams. Baltimore City, for example, I was just down with two gentlemen who are Spanish speakers or fluent Spanish speakers. So if there's not a team per se, I would say there are definitely practitioners out there who are seasoned vets who speak Spanish as well as other languages. So
Yes, there are many teams that have Spanish speakers and different languages as well on the team. ICISF does keep a roster of all registered critical incident stress management teams, and there are teams in, let's say, Puerto Rico who are predominantly Spanish speaking, but also speak English. So that is on the ICISF website as well, the team listings.
All right, lots of great questions today. Are there ongoing trainings available for this topic?
yeah, Michelle, again, kick that right back to the website. So
Exactly. Yeah, we have, we've gone virtual for these unprecedented times. In the before times, we held a lot of conferences and in-person trainings. Currently, we are all virtual. There are a few people offering in-person trainings, but locally in Maryland, we're just doing virtual trainings, but that actually makes it a lot more accessible to many people. You can do it at home. You can do it with your childcare schedule. You can do it. There are many courses that are pre-recorded that you can log on at night and do the coursework, asynchronous as well as synchronous courses. And our World Congress, which will be held in May this year, is also going to be virtual. So anybody can tune into that from around the world.
All right, and another question. Isn't the complete number of suicides also higher because of means as well as stress?
Correct. Access to means, yeah, weapons. Marc, you take this, please.
no, and just yeah, and what we know is this, and you can look at statistics, and there's going to be different statistical models, there's going to be different surveys, there's going to be different things, so the numbers might be varied. I think what the question is what we know is that the more lethal means you use, the more of a chance for an individual to actually complete the suicide. Because we're police officers, we're very comfortable with firearms. They're very accessible, and that is unfortunately the means that many of our officers in distress use. So the short answer is yes, because of the nature of our job and the tool we have at hand, that may, and again, I'm sure there's studies out there, but I would say that there's at least a relation. There's at least a correlation between that, if not, specific causation, or I can't point you to a study, but common sense would say, yeah, that's probably a reasonable statement.
Okay, and Marc, this question, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry, Michelle.
Sorry, there's also a belief that more access to death and dying and tragedy kind of desensitizes first responders to death and dying and tragedy, and makes it's not as foreign of a concept to complete the action when you've been exposed to it so much. So, take from that what you will, but that could be another reason why the completed number of suicides.
All right. And Marc, this question was posed to you. What is the name of the author of Left of Bang?
Yeah, it's Patrick Van Horn. The book is Left of Bang. It's actually, so Left of Bang is actually, Patrick Van Horn is a Marine, and he wrote a tactical manual for Marines. And how does this apply? Basically, he talks about something called heuristics. Heuristics is that when you feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up and you don't know why, Patrick Van Horn uses some people and some techniques to actually tell you why the hair on the back of your neck stands up. Heuristics is that ability to make split-second decisions using limited data. And the idea is if you can find a balance between that and actual analysis, you have a better opportunity in a high-risk situation to make the right decision, as opposed to what you might say is the wrong decision. Or if nothing else, you can make a better decision. But it's that balance between the inoculation on the front end. You have to develop those techniques based on training. You have to have good analysis. And when you push that all into the stew, it helps with that split-second decision making. The idea is that in a high-risk situation, a first responder may not have the time or the means to kind of step back and evaluate. They have to make a decision quickly. So the quicker they can process that and the quicker they understand certain cues, everything from body language to positioning to think about like a firefighter. You know, a firefighter sometimes can feel when there might be a flashover. How did you know? Because I've been doing this long enough and I just know. So if that helps, that's what it's about. It's Patrick Van Horn. It's the book is actually called Left of Bang.
All right. Let's talk about how can you help someone that in denial or refuse help?
Well, and anything in life, you of course can't make somebody accept help or address an issue that they're not ready to address. Sometimes the best we can do is leave somebody with some resources and having that touch point of, I'm somebody that cares about you. Your peers are people that care about you. People who are reaching out care about you enough to ask, hey, what's going on with you? Or I know that this happened to you, and if you ever want to talk about it or just, you know, have a cup of coffee or whatever, I'm a person that thought enough about you and that cared enough about you to ask. And then hopefully they will come to you when they're ready. Sometimes that's the best we can do, of course.
Yeah, I like to, I tend to be, and this might be shocking, I tend to be direct. And, you know, one of my things is I would like to say, hey, it looks to me like you're in a hole. And I say that because, you know, I was in a hole at one point and it looked a lot like it looks right now. Now, here's the deal. You may be functioning in your hole. You may be okay in your hole. You may have curtains in your hole. You may really dig your hole. If you like the hole, then that's kind of your choice. Here's what I'm telling you. It's really nice up here in the sunlight. Like if you want to get out of that hole, there's no expiration, there's no obligation, there's no you can, if you want to get out of the hole, you can call me 24/7, whatever, and I will help you get yourself out of the hole. I'm not dragging you out of the hole myself. You're going to have to do the work. If you'd like to get out of this hole, let me know and I will help you. In the meantime, if it's okay, I'm going to every once in a while peer down the hole and make sure you got food, water, new curtains. And if you tell me you're not in the hole, maybe I'm misreading this, but I'm just telling you what I see from my experience and from being around you that you're not right. I don't like the idea of telling people they're broken, because as soon as I tell you you're broken, that sort of indicates that you need to be fixed and I may be the one who's going to fix you. I'm not going to drive around in my car on one of those donut tires because I think that's unsafe. But if you're motivating down the road with your donut tire, I mean, you're still motivating. Is it the best approach? Not for me. But you know, like we talked about, I can't save you from yourself, and I am not maybe in a position. Now there is some obvious, you know, there's danger, there's something obvious where we need to intervene before you or somebody gets hurt. That's a whole different animal. But just in general, I mean, you kind of have to decide. You have to decide your brand of dysfunction, and you have to decide how much you want to help yourself or how much you're okay with your own dysfunction, in the most simple terms.
Wow, great discussion. We have a few more questions, but of course we are over time, and I want to respect our audience time. Please continue to send your questions in the chat menu. There is a email that you can email for any additional questions. If you need any additional answers, please feel free to email us. And thank you everyone for joining us. The webinar has been recorded and will be emailed to registrants tomorrow. The webinar will also be uploaded to our website at namimaryland.org for any individuals who were unable to register for the webinar today. We hope that this webinar has been helpful for you this afternoon. At the end of the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you'd like to see in future webinars. 1 hour of CEUs are available for Maryland Police, Corrections, and EMS professionals. Individuals pursuing CEUs must submit this survey. Each person that completes the survey will also be entered into a drawing to win a $25 Amazon gift card. This is only one webinar in a series of educational webinars that NAMI Maryland plans to host. We plan to host 2 more webinars between now and April surrounding topics of cumulative trauma and compassion cultivation. This survey will help determine how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. Our next webinar is entitled Fighting Monsters, Cumulative Trauma and First Responders, and will take place on April 5th from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Mackenzie will include the registration information in the chat now for anyone who may wish to join us. By being an attendee of this webinar, you are also invited to join us for our NAMI Walks Your Way Maryland campaign. NAMI Walks is the nation's largest and most successful mental health awareness and fundraising campaign. NAMI Maryland has been involved in NAMI Walks since the very beginning, and we invite you to join us for what we will no doubt be an incredible virtual experience. There are many ways you can make a difference in NAMI Walks, as a sponsor, as a team captain, team member, or individual participant. However you participate, you'll be joining a national movement to reduce stigma, spread awareness, and support NAMI's mission here in our own state. You can join now for free at www.namiwalks.org/Maryland. We wish you all a safe and healthy rest of your week. And please do not hesitate to reach out to us through our website or by phone at 410-884-8691 should you need additional resources or support. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.